This is the last of 4 videos covering Chapter 2 and 3. We discussed the Puritans in Massachusetts in the north. We discussed the younger sons of noblemen in Virginia and Jamestown in the south with all the variations in the southern colonies. This is the middle colonies in between the two. And the question here is, with perfect weather, not perfect weather, but with much better weather, not hot and muggy and swampy, not too cold like New England, and pretty good fertile farmland, why are these the last 2 colonies to be settled? Some pretty simple answers for that. They are very different and very much alike each other in certain ways. So I'm going to do New Netherlands first. Netherlands, of course, was the word for Holland at the time. Today it is the Netherlands. And they settled, they had explorers there, almost the same year as Jamestown, 1609. Henry Hudson actually went up the Hudson River looking for a northwest passage, which of course he didn't find. He also discovered and explored for Europeans Hudson's Bay. Hudson River is a beautiful, deep, wide river. Remember, there was a plane landed on it a couple years ago. This is why New York City is a great world port and had been from the very beginning. The Dutch had been banned by Spain from the Spanish colonies. They were trade and economic rivals, and Spain basically was at war with Holland a lot of the time. But the Spanish had pretty much monopolized Central and South America, so the Dutch, again, are looking for a different place to settle. They were still looking for a northwest passage. Remember that the Dutch are then and now are completely dependent on trade. This is a very small country, half of it's underwater. How come it's a very prosperous and has been for centuries? Trade, shipping and trade. Today, the port of Rotterdam still gets 500 ships a day landing there. Most of what comes through Europe comes through Rotterdam in Holland. By 1650, there were 10,000 ships a year that landed in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, all the way to Japan. It is the Dutch that opened Japan to the west, Southeast Asia. This is a great trading place. So they're looking for a northwest passage. Because it's a great world trading empire, they were looking for basically a supply depot, a stopover place on the way to Asia, which North America was, and a lot of competition with Spain, particularly in the trading and shipping business. So New Netherlands is set up, and if you look at the slides are starting with slide number 33 in that file. New Netherlands is set up from the beginning as a fur trading post. Furs run out pretty quickly, as a pirate base against the Spanish galleons sailing back with gold and silver, and as a layover place for Dutch ships. It is called the West India Company, west of India. Furs were never terribly lucrative. They begin to settle. They used what it was called the patroon system, a Dutch word, patron, basically. It's a feudal system exactly like most of Europe was at the time. One settler, if he came with his family, got a mile frontage on the Hudson River, which would be worth tens of millions today. Any adult who came was given 40 acres by the king. If you brought any servants, you were given 50 acres per servant that you brought. Unfortunately, the government of the colony was very hierarchical and very incompetent. The directors at one point were even taxing the Indians to make war upon the Indians. So that shows you how bad the government was. They were pretty much clueless. They wanted to run things exactly like they were in Amsterdam, and it didn't work in North America. Very few Dutch come. If you look at those slides, slide number 34 and 35 are paintings of Amsterdam at this period. You'll notice there's not any poor people there. It looks lovely. We could move in tomorrow. This is a place that has great prosperity. And the other thing about the Dutch then and now is they were very, very liberal, particularly in religious matters. If you wanted a religious book printed that might get you in trouble at home, you went to Holland, they printed everything. They had I've got the numbers here, 39 publishers in Holland, and they printed half of the books that were printed in the 1600s. So those Puritans, before they came to America, the Pilgrims went to Holland first and then came to America because they were totally tolerated. Nobody messed with them. So it was a refuge for religious refugees of all kinds. Multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual. In Amsterdam, a lot of mixed races and religions. What happens in the New World, of course, is nobody wants to come from Holland. Why would you go? It's complete toleration, and it's incredibly prosperous. Nobody wants to risk that voyage and live in the middle of a wilderness. So very few Dutch came. They had to open the colony to settlers from anywhere that they could get just to build it up. So by 1700, New York City is very much like it is now, 18 languages. You walk down the street in New York City today, you will hear dozens of different languages. Same thing in the 1600s. 42% Dutch, 30% British, 9% French, 1% Jewish, again, religious toleration, 18% African American. Why? The Dutch were heavily involved in the slave trade, so there are a lot of African Americans in New York very early. Swedes, Finns, everybody came. Now, how does it become British? How do people usually gain land? Through wars. And this is a period where the Dutch and the English happen to be on opposite sides in a war. There was King Charles on the British throne. He is childless, but his younger brother James, the younger brother of the king, always has, still today, the title the Duke of York. So Prince Charles's younger brothers, the oldest one, is the Duke of York still today. And Prince Harry will eventually become the Duke of York because William will inherit the crown. So King Charles is at war with Holland. He sends his younger brother, James, the Duke of York, go and take New Netherlands. James was the guy who was getting in trouble, of course, as Admiral of the Ocean Fleet and not a very good military commander. The Dutch tried to mount a defense. That guy with the very long dark hair in the next slide, I think, is Peter Stuyvesant. Peter Stuyvesant was the military governor of New Netherlands, of New Amsterdam, and he tried to mount a defense. He tried to gather colonists. He actually does get 500 Dutch to oppose the British, who are landing several thousand men off of a fleet of 15, 20 ships. The 93 leaders in the colony and Peter Stuyvesant's own son petitioned the British for surrender. They would not fight. The 500 Dutch soldiers that he organized surrendered without firing a shot. Remember what the Dutch are interested in: trade. If you leave us alone to trade, we don't care who's in charge. The Dutch government's not doing much for us anyway. Then James did a very intelligent thing, which is rare for the British monarchy at the time. He let the Dutch alone. He let them keep their language, their customs, their churches, their own schools, their local governments. Each town could vote on which church to support and how to run their local affairs. So New York for a long time is bilingual, bicultural, multi-ethnic. It still is today. It has this background all the way back to the 1600s. This is why when you were little, you read the Rip Van Winkle stories, Nathaniel Hawthorne's tales. Those are Dutch folk tales translated into English. So they had a lasting impression, including on the language, which I'll talk about later. So New Netherlands is fairly simple. Pennsylvania is a little more complicated because we are introducing a new religion here. Pennsylvania is a Quaker city on a hill. Who are the Quakers? Not Quackers, take the C out of there, they're not little ducks. Quakers called themselves the Society of Friends, and they called each other friend. Friend Jones, friend Mabel, friend Mary. Other people called them the Quakers because the Spirit of God moved them, and they would have tremors, they would shake and feel God within them, and that's where Quakers came in. They quaked. This is not a small religion in the 1700s. Again, by the time of the Revolution, they are the third largest religion in the American colonies, in the British colonies, over 200,000 of them. Founded, remember that branching tree of Protestantism? Once you have the Protestant Revolution and people interpret things their own way, you begin to get all kinds of strange branches, and Quakerism was one of the strange branches. It was founded by George Fox about 1650 in Britain. It was a pretty radical branch of extreme Protestantism. The British Crown hated them. You'll find out why in a minute. They were persecuted. Hundreds were killed. Many were thrown in prison. Again, you lose all your property if you're arrested and thrown in prison. And many, many come to America. The colony is founded about 1675, and 90 ships come in the next 3 or 4 years with over 7,000 colonists. So it booms from the beginning. The goal of the Quakers, let's talk about Quakerism first, I think. Quaker religion, slide number 40, so you get it down. It's not difficult. Their goal was to recreate the early simple form of Christianity. So the first church, the first Christian churches, if you remember the apostles, there were no ministers, there were no buildings, there were no titles, there were no different classes. Everybody was equal. And that's what the Quakers were trying to recreate. This is an optimistic religion. They are the flip side of the Puritans. They called God a God, and I'm quoting, of light and love. They emphasized the New Testament, thou shalt, rather than the Old Testament, thou shalt not, and God will smack you down if you get out of line. They believed any person could find they called it an inner light, or the Spirit of God within themselves. You can find your own salvation. Look inward, God will come to you. Christ's sacrifice made salvation available for all men. The difference, although there's some connections with the Puritans, God will judge you by what you do. There is no predestination here. It is all free will. They're not worried about original sin. God isn't determining everything. Whatever you do in life, God will judge you by your actions and your morals, your beliefs. Because they're following the early church, like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, they recognize no political or religious authority. Each man is governed by his own conscience. This is where the problems came in with the British government and why the British government was persecuting them. Number one, they're pacifists. They still are today. There are Quaker congregations in Austin today. If you want to go to a Quaker meeting, they're very small, but there are several in Austin. They still exist. They're a very small denomination today. But they are still pacifists. If all men are brothers, why would we kill our brothers? So the king cannot draft these guys. He can go ahead and draft them. They refuse to fight, even in self-defense. They do not kill, even in self-defense. So this is number one reason the British king wanted them out. They're dead weight to him. There was no standing militia in Pennsylvania when they set up the government in Pennsylvania. There was no citizen soldiers. They did not believe in killing. This is why they got along really well with Native Americans. William Penn made sure that he signed very good treaties and treated Indians very well and was very kind and generous to them. But the other reason, of course, is that all men are equal. All can be saved. In Pennsylvania, when it is set up, there is total religious freedom. I cannot tell anybody else what to believe or what religion he should follow. The only thing they were concerned about was people being persecuted for their religious beliefs. So, everyone is equal. Native Americans had peace for 70 years in Pennsylvania. They did not try to convert them. The Quakers are very big in when we finally set up an Indian Bureau in the federal government all the way through, and still are in the Bureau of Indian Affairs today. For a long time, it was run completely by Quakers. They did not sell alcohol to the Indians. They made fair trades with them. They did not enslave them. They even tried Native Americans for crimes with mixed juries of Indians and whites, which was unheard of at the time. So they're very, very charitable that way. Elders were respected as models and teachers. Women were considered equal with men, way ahead of their time. Remember, everybody is a friend. Women could get up and preach. Women had legal powers that they did not have in other places. Children were considered equal. They had equal souls with adults. So disobeying kids, although it's not all that common, were not a problem for the Quakers. They did not punish disobedient children. Children could get up in church and lecture adults as well. They could talk back. This would never happen in a Puritan house, or probably either in most of the South as well. Slaves, they are the first. Actually, they came to it. The very early Quakers, some of them were slaveholders, but this is a group that is largely middle class, that comes from the middle part of England, small villages, craftsmen. They are the first to denounce slavery, the first to begin abolition societies. Very quickly, they decide that no Quaker can be a slave owner. And if you did own slaves, you either had to free them or you were thrown out of church. You were not allowed to continue as a Quaker. Not only that, but they boycotted and would not buy any products made with slave labor, such as sugar, rice, cotton later on, some of the indigo dyes and native dyes that were made. This, again, was pretty radical for its time because nobody else was doing this. They practiced what they preached. Later on, they also staffed almost completely the Underground Railway. So heavily involved with Indian affairs, heavily involved with ending slavery in America. The other tenet, the other belief of Quakers is simplicity. Very strong work ethic. You should not be lazy, but you live simply, and number one, you are charitable. They are very anti-materialistic. They are very socialist. Plain dress, there's a couple pictures there, even of Quakers as late as 1900, plainly dressed, plain speech, plain living, avoid comfort. This sounds like the Puritans, and they originate roughly at the same time in England. No ornamentation, simple clothing, set fair prices for your products. You must be charitable if you have any way to be charitable at all. So they actually did preach and practice. If you go in your kitchen and you have 3 spoons to cook with, you don't need 3 spoons. Give one to someone who needs it. You can probably get by with 2. And they actually practiced this. No drinking alcohol of any kind, no horse racing. Marriage was a civil ceremony without ministers. No social ranks, no bowing to nobility, no tipping your hat, no titles. They had schools. They had free public schools. Children should go to school, not as strong as the Puritans, because for the Puritans, if you couldn't read the Bible, you're pretty much going to go to hell. For the Quakers, it was good to read the Bible, but it was less important because you had to feel the Spirit within you, not from the Bible, but from God within you, the inner light. That was the important thing. Today, there are about 100,000 Quakers in America, well under 1% of our religious people. And they led all of the reform movements, abolition, women's rights. Some of the early doctors were Quakers, prison reformers. They're involved with everything. So this sounds so American. Everybody's equal. What was the problem with the Quakers? How come they declined shortly after the Revolution? They were big before. Number one, they're not competitive. They're not individualistic. This is a time and a place where people come from Europe and they go crazy. Oh my God, I can have 100 acres. I can make myself into a wealthy man. Quakers are saying the opposite. You shouldn't be a wealthy man. You should share with your neighbors. The other thing that really got them trouble in North America is they are pacifist, and they would not fight the Indians even when their neighbors were being attacked. The Indians figured out pretty quickly, leave those Quaker guys alone, they're not going to bother us. But they would not help. So Pennsylvania, which was run by Quakers before the Revolution, after the Revolution, they're voted out of office because there's enough non-Quakers there, and they really never become as powerful again. So how did we get Pennsylvania? There's a good map there, and it tells you why it was fairly late, in the late 1600s. Number one, there is a river that goes to Philadelphia, but Pennsylvania is the only one of the 13 colonies that has no Atlantic coastline. There is no direct access to the sea, and the sea is the highway. Everything comes by the sea. Number two, when you get into Pennsylvania, there's a lot of mountains and they run the wrong way. So if you're trying to move west, you're going up a mountain, down a mountain, up and down. And if you ever drive through western Pennsylvania, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like a roller coaster. The Indian tribes in the western part of Pennsylvania had not been wiped out. Disease had not hit them yet, and they were oftentimes strongly resistant as well. So how do we get Pennsylvania? There is Penn Jr. and Sr. William Penn Sr. was a military admiral in the British Navy. Pacifist? There's a catch to that. He was an admiral, and after he retired from his military career, he converted to Quakerism. And his son was raised a Quaker. Now, the King of England, this is a James, owes Penn Sr., his naval commander, a lot of favors. Number one, Penn Sr. lent him a lot of money. So he owes money, and he also helped James get out of some really close scrapes because James was not a very good admiral at all. So he owes him favors and money. To pay him back, Penn Sr. goes to the king and asks for a grant of land so that Quakers can have a city on a hill. They can have their society. The British are happy to get rid of him. They can't use him in the military. They don't swear oaths in office. They were a pain to deal with. So this is set up as another holy experiment, as they called it, another city on a hill, a Quaker model of what the world should be. The other thing, they wouldn't pay taxes in England as well. They acknowledged no government authority, only your inner voice. So this is a problem for the king. So the king gives him the largest single land grant to a single family in the history of the world, millions of acres in Pennsylvania. They start coming in 1675. They start slacking off shortly after 1700, but tens of thousands come. Mainly families, so more single men than Massachusetts, but mainly families. They did not send you home if you showed up without your family, by the way, or showed up single. Very few rich, very few poor, middle class, craftsmen, merchants, artisans, small farmers. If you had a poor Quaker family in the neighborhood who wanted to emigrate with you, the wealthier would pay for the passage of the poor. They are really community oriented. Because Penn advertised this colony all over Europe in different languages, it attracts a lot of foreigners as well, non-British, particularly Germans. German religion had split into dozens of these unique little strange sects, denominations, things like the Amish, the Mennonite, the Dunkers. There were dozens of these. They were also being persecuted in Germany, most of them also being pacifists. So they are encouraged to come, and Penn advertised to them to come to Pennsylvania. Total religious toleration, of course, as in Rhode Island. So this is another place where there is freedom of religion from the beginning. And that's where we get Pennsylvania Dutch. There are no Dutch in Pennsylvania, very few. Deutsch is the word for German in German. So the Pennsylvania Dutch are Pennsylvania Deutsch. They are Pennsylvania Germans, not Dutch. 32,000 come there before 1700. This is a huge, well-developed colony. Biggest city in America before the Revolution, Philadelphia. even though it's 100 miles from the ocean, had more newspapers than London and more printers than any place else in the country, which is why Ben Franklin ended up there. Why did people come? Well-planned, organized, tolerant. You got off the boat. Penn would sell you very cheaply a big piece of land, anything from 100 to 500 acres per family. Land could be divided equally among your daughters and sons, particularly if you had no sons. That was very attractive. Houses were built together in small groups and surrounded with small farms, not nuclear like the Puritans, and not spread out like the South. Kind of in between. It is a middle colony. Penn based his government on John Locke, who we'll talk about later. Very democratic. Hang on, let me change this. Get my timer reset. Very democratic. Any adult male, if you owned property or not, could vote. You had a 72-man ruling council that was voted in by the people. Taxes were voted on by the public. You voted on your own taxes. Very, what we would call libertarian today. I'm quoting one of the Penns here. Men will reciprocate if treated kindly and justly. This is why the Puritans didn't like them. You have to have rules for everything for the Puritans. Liberty of conscience. Even if you have wrong and stupid ideas, the Quakers believed you have the liberty of your own conscience. So there are jury trials. There is only one capital offense, as opposed to over 200 in Britain and in many of the Puritan colonies. Very few crimes. The only thing they really were concerned about was crimes against people, not crimes against property, was very lightly punished. Quakers particularly concerned about exploiting inferiors, indentured servants, slaves, Indians. Good example, remember adultery is a death sentence in Puritan colonies. Adultery, if convicted of adultery in Pennsylvania, was a year prison sentence for the first one, a life term for the second. No death penalty for it. If a master got his servant pregnant, he had to marry her. I'm not sure what happened to if he was already married. I haven't read anything about that. But if a man got a woman pregnant in Pennsylvania, you were obligated to marry her. So very different than the southern colonies. Pennsylvania took off. The Quaker religion was very strong for a long time and then slowly disappeared. But it is still out there today. Very American, very democratic, very Christian, perhaps too Christian for America. Not fighting Indians, not accumulating property, not very American at the time. Okay, and that's the end of the 13 colonies. Thanks.